Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor of Lincoln Square. And joining me today is my very good friend, Ken Coleman. Ken is a Detroit historian and a longtime journalist. He's written, am I correct, 4 books?
Yes, and
4 books.
contributor on a fifth.
Yeah, on Black history. He's written for many publications, including the Detroit Free Press, the Michigan Chronicle. And back in 2018, Ken and I started up a little outlet called the Michigan Advance, which was exhausting, but a lot of fun. So
Great.
thank you so much for joining us today, Ken.
Thank you so much for having me. When I got the email, I said yes, yes, and yes.
Well, today is Juneteenth, which is a federal and state holiday for many states.
Mhm.
And I know you've written many pieces on the history of Juneteenth. So, what should people know about this holiday and its significance?
Well, it is the origin of it is tied to the Civil War, and most specifically, the end of the Civil War. We all remember from our American history and civics courses that President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, which effectively ended slavery for many African Americans, but not all.
Mhm.
And Juneteenth celebrates or remembers when about 250,000 African Americans in Texas first learned of the Emancipation Proclamation. That occurred about 2.5 years after President Lincoln issued the seminal document, edict. It is called Juneteenth because Union General Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas on June the 19th, 1865. And so taking the month June and the date 19th, putting them together, and that's why we call it Juneteenth today.
And, I was a history major, but I do not remember even in like my AP American history class learning anything about Juneteenth. It wasn't until I actually took, classes that were dedicated to African American history where I learned about it. Do you think that more kids are learning about Juneteenth today? Is that changing?
It has, and it has changed, Susan, very rapidly, relatively speaking. I mean, I can remember being a high school student in Detroit, Michigan, and not knowing anything at all about Juneteenth. I learned about it as an adult over the years, and here in Detroit and by extension Michigan, knowledge of the recognition of the date has really exploded,
Hmm.
particularly in the 2000s. You might remember, I think you were reporting at the time in Michigan, a former state senator, Martha Scott, authored a bill that actually passed both chambers in the Michigan legislature, and then Governor Jennifer Granholm signed, and this was 2005, signed a bill recognizing the date. And so really probably for the last 25 years, it's been on it's been on the radar of more and more people.
And what accounts for the reason why people have been celebrating the date more and bringing more attention to it?
Well, I think there's at least in the sort of 35,000 foot sense,
Hmm.
there's been, at least in my adult lifetime, there's been more of a recognition and understanding and a sense of inclusion when it comes to history related to people of color.
Hmm.
I would not only say the African American community, but the Latino or Hispanic communities too. You've seen more inclusion in history. That's part of it. But if we think about really the last several years, we all know that after the murder of George Floyd in
In
Minneapolis
2020.
in 2020, and then the attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you began to see a fast forwarding, if you will, in state legislatures and on Capitol Hill in DC, trying to find ways to, through policy and the like, trying to find ways to reconcile what has been a tremendous sin in my estimation, and that is sometimes purposely leaving out um, history of this country that involves people of color.
Right. And Juneteenth became a federal holiday because of a law signed in 2021 by President Biden. Of course, we know that our current president, Donald Trump, has waged quite the war on DEI and many diversity efforts since he took office.
Mhm.
And now we're seeing, just like with Pride Month, which, is in June also,
Yeah.
there are many corporations that are backing off of their support for Juneteenth, like Verizon and Amazon. So what does that mean for, the future of these Juneteenth celebrations and just, diversity efforts in America in general?
Well, I think there's genuine concern that people have that this moving away from this corporate moving away from um, celebrations like Juneteenth, or at least financial backing of them. There's concern that these efforts could go away, or the momentum that we've experienced in the last 5 years, and particularly with Juneteenth, that would go away or subside. We've seen some reporting in recent days that around the country, largely because some corporations have moved away from supporting Juneteenth programming, that you're going to see smaller attendance
Hmm.
as opposed to greater attendance. I think it somewhat emanates from, even though the Trump administration has indicated that they have no plans to try to do away with Juneteenth. Certainly, the signaling through rhetoric, through edict, federal edict under the power of the president, going after DEI programs, could spill over into efforts to recognize important months in our country, like Pride Month, like Juneteenth, and other either cultural and to some extent religious observances that are public.
Right. And there's been a lot of criticism about, the corporate culture, like at Pride events or, with corporate sponsorships, of Juneteenth and other efforts. But that also does indicate more acceptance and more people acknowledging and being supportive of these efforts. And so it does seem to cut both ways. And when you
Mhm.
see that those corporations are starting to make the calculation that it's better to go back in time than to go forward, that doesn't seem to be a great sign for progress.
It doesn't. And your love of history, my love of history, suggests to me, and I think probably you as well, that when you have corporate and to some extent government um, activity that would push back against these celebrations, the people have an opportunity. And you've seen boycotts being carried out against corporations, retailers in particular, by people of color and others to push back
Right.
and to
Target in
Target,
particular.
yeah,
Yeah.
Target to be sure, Walmart
Hmm.
to be sure. Walmart moved back against DEI policies, or at least announced it the end of last year. And there
Hmm.
was a protest just up the road from me in Southfield, Michigan, at a Sam's Club, which is owned by Walmart,
Hmm.
pushing back against everyday people, just pushing back against Walmart's move away from DEI. And so I think, to kind of go a long way to get to your point, or at least speak to your last point or comment question, um, if if corporations see where their bottom line is being affected, they will cease to move in ways that go against protesters. And I think that's what you're going to see. You're going to there'll be these two competing entities will sort of battle it out in the way that the way that civil rights activity was carried out in the 50s and 60s.
Right. You kind of had this ironic push and pull here because uh, a lot of these companies have seen that their revenues have gone up by, courting valuable demographics and, having merchandise that reflects Black pride or gay pride. And
Mhm.
so there's a real financial incentive for them. But then, ironically, from what's supposed to be a conservative government, there's pressure not to have those efforts that might actually, be costing them revenue, but they don't want to have trouble with Trump's
The
regulators. So
administration.
it's
Mhm.
it's a different situation than we've really dealt with before because we have a president who is really inserting himself into a lot of these private business decisions, which is certainly not something that we used to see from Republicans as much.
That's right. And that's when, and sort of following this closely over the last handful of days and maybe week, you're seeing, at least I see through the reporting and through some reporting that has the president's spokespeople attributed in pieces. It seems as if the Trump administration kind of wants it both ways,
Mm,
in the sense that, number one, they're saying, well, we're not really against Juneteenth. We haven't said that. We're not trying to kill that holiday. By the way,
hmm.
as you know, it would take an act of Congress
Right.
along with the president. The president couldn't unilaterally do away with Juneteenth. But he understands business, or
Hmm.
maybe not understand, but you know what I mean. His orientation comes from profit and dollars and
Hmm.
transactional, uh, whether it's metaphorical or literal. That's the way he kind of sees things.
Hmm.
And so it'll be very interesting. They have indicated. Oh, he said when he was having a rally in 2000 um, that was planned on the same day of Juneteenth. He said he didn't know about the holiday, and he said the holiday will be remembered by and learned by more people because I had a rally that day. Nobody ever heard of Juneteenth, and so
Oh, right. I remember
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I didn't,
Yeah.
I didn't remember that from the campaign, but I read it this week. I think the point is, it'll be interesting. You're right. Trump's pushback is very different than what you would have saw with governors in the South during the civil rights era, right? Um, Trump pays attention to the dollar, and
Hmm.
corporations pay attention to the dollar. And so if their pushback is met with effective boycotting, that might change their minds.
Hmm. Well, many cities are holding Juneteenth events. I know you've covered several of them, especially in Detroit. Uh, but the Wall Street Journal had a really interesting piece today about Plano, Illinois, which kind of pioneered a Juneteenth celebration there before it was a federal or state holiday. But they've actually canceled their fifth annual celebration because businesses would not sponsor the event. They were fearful of losing customers. So, how does that bode for celebrations in the future?
Well, I think it's the sign in Plano, in the Midwest, the middle of the country,
Hmm.
could be a cautionary tale for what we might see in the future. Again, I think this is going to be interesting. Um, Not only from sort of watching this evolve, this year and in future years, this push and pull, this tug of different ideas, which one sort of rises or succeeds in what it's trying to do. I do believe that you have seen tremendous pushback, at least in the African American community, to be sure. The Target boycott, while hasn't necessarily been, I haven't really seen tangible studies per se that speak to an African American boycott of the Target retailer, what effect that has been. I can only tell you anecdotally um, that in spaces like metropolitan Detroit and in Detroit proper, that's a super African American majority.
Right.
You hear anecdotally that there are some wins and people are motivated, meaning people who are pushing back against corporations that are moving against DEI. So I think this will be just like when we were writing about the pandemic in real time, Susan. It might take months and years for us to sort of realize or understand, what has been the fallout, and how do we quantify what impact has been in one way or another.
Yeah. Well, last year, you and I actually wrote a really long story together for the Michigan Advance before the presidential election about how Black voters could prove pivotal in the election in Michigan. Detroit, of course, is the largest majority African American city once again in America. And you interviewed quite a few Black voters for Trump. You know, these were the folks who were
Mhm,
waiting in line hours before he was going to show up on stage.
mhm.
The African American vote has been absolutely essential for the Democratic Party for decades. Do you think that Republicans are making real inroads there?
They have made some, and covering politics for many years, and that sometimes taking a respite from journalism and working in politics, if you will, in government and campaigns. What I often remind people is when I get the question that you asked, um, you know, pretty much for the last 50 years, African Americans, about 90% of African Americans vote for Democratic nominees, particularly at the presidential level, U.S. presidential level. It really only takes 2 or 3% um, for the Republicans to secure of that 90%, to make it very difficult for a Democrat to win. For example, we saw exit polling that suggested in 2000, and pretty similar again in 2020, in 2020, and,
Hmm.
and and pretty much in 2024 too, that upwards of 20% of African American men voted for Donald Trump.
Hmm.
That's a significant number, and that
Right.
goes to that 2 or 3% that I spoke about earlier. By and large, African Americans are vote Democratic, and that because the Democratic Party offers policies that um, most African Americans can relate to. But if a Republican, i.e., Donald Trump, is able to get 1 out of every 5 African American men, and maybe 1 out of 10 African American women, couple that with a growing Latino vote that's
Right.
going more and more for Republican nominees, depending on the state. The electoral college in a particular state. That's a recipe for Republicans to win national elections at the federal level.
Right. And, this is a change from when Barack Obama was on the ballot, and you did not see that sort of deep gender gap in the African American community. And once again, there was an African American nominee with Kamala Harris, but
Mhm.
it does seem that that gender gap is growing within the Black community. And I'm just kind of curious how you account for that.
I just call it for what it is, Susan. A lot of it, in the main, it's just straight up sexism.
Mm.
I've talked to, unfortunately, too many African American men um, who aren't ready not only to vote for an African American woman, but they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either,
Mm.
in her race against Donald Trump
In
um,
2016.
in 2016. Yeah, I think that's sad. It's unfortunate because I think those same men routinely may vote for a city council member in Detroit who attracts enough votes to be president of that local legislative body. Some states have elected. I mean, Detroit is probably one of the only American cities with a sizable African American community that haven't elected a woman as mayor.
Right.
Um, and
Which
that's
could change this year.
yeah, because there's a couple leading notable candidates who happen to be women, and so that could change this year. But we've had city council presidents, for example. The two women that are running for mayor have both been city council presidents, and so I think the glass ceiling, hasn't risen to the federal level, or no, I wouldn't say federal level, but certainly hasn't risen to the presidential election. But I've talked to so many people, so many Black men who, just aren't ready to vote for a woman, and they never really say it that way, but you hear it
Mm.
in their position on issues and the like. It's sad, but that. So I think to answer your question, um, sexism plays a large role in that.
There also seems to be some divisions by age, and I've heard, a critique in talking with a lot of people who, have been part of the civil rights movement for a long time, that they feel that, some of the younger generations just may not be as aware of the history and the struggle. Um, and it's just been harder to reach those younger voters. I don't know what you found. I mean, you have a son who's a teenager, so you're well aware of uh what the concerns are for Gen Z, for instance.
I do think that um, that generation does not have, unfortunately, the same grasp on history um, that people our age do, and the love of history that you and I and others have. They don't often have that. Um, they grow into that. I didn't come out of the womb, thinking I was going to be a reporter and write about history and the like. It evolved over time,
Hmm.
and maybe in that same way with me, it might, that it might strike the fancy of a 17, 18, or 19-year-old. I will say that, we are, and I guess every generation probably says this. They do because we recorded it. These are very peculiar times, and even though, we the civil rights movement, for example, was very different than um, FDR's New Deal generation in some ways. The kids that I grew up in the 70s and 80s. These times are very different for me. You always, as African Americans in particular, the community always had the sense that every generation would stand on the shoulders of their parents and grandparents and rise up to that next notch of social or economic attainment. I'm just fearful that this could be the first generation that in some ways doesn't. That's not so much on them. I mean, that generation. I think it's just the forces out here today um, are very, very, very peculiar and unique to what we've seen in the past.
Right. And as we get further and further away from, the times of Jim Crow and, the fight for the Voting Rights Act, the same way that we're far away from the Holocaust, those memories fade. More and more people aren't with us anymore, who fought those battles. And so, this is just the nature of history over and over again, that sometimes we do have to keep fighting those same battles over and over again.
It's true, but and so I've said this in the last breath or two. But going back to that summer of the George Floyd murder, and as you know, you were my editor and editing a lot of the stories that I authored, because we take ourselves back five years in time, we were also right smack dab in the start of the pandemic.
Right.
And, I spent more time in Detroit at home than I did in Lansing and the capital.
Hmm.
And covering those daily um, rallies, young people largely, pushing back against the Floyd murder and advocating for diversity, equity, inclusion. A lot of those were young white people,
Yeah.
and young white people that didn't live in Detroit proper.
Hmm.
And so while I spent some time moments ago talking about my concern about the generation, I'm also inspired. I mean, I do think that in general, um, people of color and whites and others who happen to be of that age group, Gen Z, they get along with each other better than my generation or other generations, because
Yeah.
a lot of them have grown up together in
Right.
ways where, my parents and grandparents didn't grow up, down the street from, white people.
They weren't able to.
They weren't able to. And we have a generation because of, um, quite frankly, DEI, DEI at the local level, at City Hall, DEI, at the state and federal level, where people of color were able to attain jobs and an existence that allowed them to move into spaces with people that they didn't know before. Maybe that will prevail, and maybe that coming together of young people, white, black, brown, coming together in ways to push back against what we're seeing coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and in some spaces on Capitol Hill. It's going to take a fight. It's going to take pushback, to be sure, because I do think that there's not think we know, this pushback against particularly DEI has ramifications both in the public and private sector.
Right. And there was a sizable No Kings protest in Detroit
Mhm,
over the
mhm.
weekend, and in many cities around Michigan. And Detroit has been one of those cities that's been targeted for the ICE raids.
Yeah.
And I know there's been pushback for that. Michigan also will be very hard hit by Trump's tariffs, especially because we're still the home of the domestic auto industry,
Mhm.
and our lines of production are so tied in with Canada. And
Yeah.
so, there are a lot of impacts that will be felt, in Detroit, in Michigan, and in some ways more than in other parts of the country. Trump did win Michigan last fall, and this was the second time. He also won in 2016. What have you been hearing from folks around Detroit, Metro Detroit, about the job that he's doing? What are the concerns that people have now?
Well, I talk to people, and in particular, I'm thinking about people of color in Detroit proper and metropolitan Detroit. Some people do. Some people who either did not vote or
Mhm.
did vote for Trump are having buyer's remorse.
Okay.
And on the other end, you have people saying, "Well, we told you so." Yeah, yeah. So I mean, we tried to. So I do
Which may
think
not
that,
be helpful.
which right, of course. Um, but I think what you are going to see, I think the No More King styled rallies will continue. Certainly, over the summer and warmer months, I think that there will be momentum. Michigan is a state, as you know, as you pointed out, the numbers. It's more purple than anything else.
Hmm.
Democrats do win statewide election. The three executives in state government are all Democrats, but Republicans do win statewide elections as well. And so this is one of those where, they used to call them battlegrounds. I'm not sure what they're calling them these days.
Swing states, battlegrounds, purple states.
Yeah, but but the the states like Michigan will be in play, and the question becomes: do people who are concerned about Trump policies and an attack on DEI, how do they respond? Do they respond
Mhm.
by saying, "Well, I can't do anything. I'm going to stay at home," or do they push back through organizing, which leads to momentum, helps ultimate turnout. Here in Michigan, we've got a pretty important, now there'll be two U.S. Senate races, a U.S. Senate race coming up. And that's going to be really important too.
In
Where the
addition to the governor's race
In addition to
next
the
year.
governor's race, yeah. And this will be, I read someplace, Susan, and you probably know this factoid. This will be the first time, probably ever, or certainly in generations, where in Michigan you've got in a general election, you've got a presidential coming up against a with a gubernatorial, not a president, not a state senate race God, how did that statistic go? It couldn't be presidential because it's coming up too
Maybe
close.
it's an open gubernatorial and an open Senate seat.
Yeah, that's what it was. So those races are a lot more dynamic. Both sides kind of see a path to victory. That's going to motivate some people, will dissuade others. But this will be a state nonetheless. It'll be interesting to watch. It always is. In 16, Trump won Michigan by 10,000 votes.
Right.
Biden by 100,000 votes. I think Trump by 100, was it
about 150?
About 150,000. Wasn't it about the same, the Trump victory in Michigan?
I think it was about 80.
About 80. So, I mean, those are all, each one of those numbers, I don't necessarily know 100,000 people that didn't vote, but we know, we look at data and you see turnouts, you see margins, and you see pockets where people just didn't show up. We always say in the Black community that if Barack Obama was on the ballot every time, we'd have 50% turnout. Because those 08 and 12 election, particularly 08, was phenomenal. I had to wait about 2 hours to vote. That's never been the case.
Right.
That was before early voting and things like that. But it was tremendous turnout. Yeah.
Well, Ken, where can people find all of your great work? Because you are always posting your daily on this day events, not just in Michigan, but just in history. And you continue to write. So where can people find you?
Well, I'm certainly on Facebook at Ken Coleman. Every day I post on this day. It's important history that happened on the particular date on the calendar. I'm also on X, formerly Twitter. I've been contemplating finding a new home for that content, but I'm still there at History Lives DET. History Lives LIVES DET, the first three letters of Detroit. And we post actively there. Interestingly enough, Susan, I posted this morning talking about Donald Trump. On this day in 1997, Donald Trump is in Detroit bidding for a casino license.
I saw that.
In a majority African-American city. He had an African-American partner, former Detroit Lions football player who passed away several years ago, Mel Farr Jr. But they were in 1997 on June 19th, they were trying to get, Trump in particular, trying to get a casino license in Detroit. For comic book buffs, there's a Marvel Comics used to have a series called What If? What if Trump actually got that casino? Does he ever become president? One of those three casinos. It was a big,
right.
Big for three casinos. But yeah. So that I post factoids like that, historically related factoids like that each morning.
You should definitely follow Ken because you will find out so much about our history that you never knew. He's great at digging it up. And thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you again. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.